today we're going to talk about the lesser ritual of the pentagram and things related thereto. I think the first thing to note when looking at it is this is probably one of the most common rituals of modern magic. Almost everyone who has studied any form of ceremonial magic or modern ritual magic is familiar with it. Most books on the subject have some variation of it. Even books that are dealing with more specific topics on ceremonial magic often have some variant of the lesser banishing ritual reworked in order to fit whatever it is that they're doing. It's used as the basis for a lot of rituals that people design when working group ritual, because it's basically the structure that people learn ritual from. Yeah, and it's a very workable structure. And even banishings in Wicca draw from this. And this is both in traditional Wicca as well as eclectic Wicca. You'll see variants of the lesser banishing ritual. If you look at Herman Slater, the anonymously written Pagan Way materials that form Book of Pagan Rituals, in it, the opening is basically the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram. My mentor at one point was married to a woman that was a Gardnerian and an Alexandrian third degree, and when he was going through the initiations with that, one of the first rituals he went to, they began opening, and it was basically the pentagram ritual, and his wife leaned into him and was like, "See, this is where that ceremonial magic stuff that you do came from." So he had a good laugh over them kind of swapping the history on it. Now, as far as the history on this ritual goes, we'll touch on that really quickly because it's not too germane to most of what I want to look at with it. But it's not really a ritual that goes back to anything beyond the Golden Dawn for the most part. Rigardi notes that in trying to find other rituals that it could be based on, he couldn't find anything similar historically. Personally, I think that's because while there were other forms of lodge magic, or magic that were done in groups of people mimicking Freemasonry, prior to the Golden Dawn really represented a sea change in how people talked about magic and thought about magic and presented the idea of magic. And Crowley kind of took that change much further with opening things up and making it something that could be accessible in commercially viable books. Rigardi took it even further, making it even more plain language, as did Dion Fortune. And then we have the whole rest of the magical revival and the neo-pagan movement following off of the works of Rigardi and Dion Fortune. As far as this particular ritual, which really is the basis of a lot of those movements, it does have parts that come from earlier things. The Kabbalistic cross comes from a passage in Eliphas Levi, who claims that this is the mystical version of the Lord's Prayer, because it's basically referencing a passage from the Lord's Prayer, and he describes this as the version that magicians and mystics did as their way of using this same prayer that was common in Christianity. The actual pentagram ritual we find in some older Jewish prayer books as a prayer that was said before going to bed, calling upon the angels of the four directions, of the archangels, for protection, and then invoking the swirling divine light above, which, based on the description in some of these prayer books, sounds like the divine presence is accorded to the Shekhinah. But that's pretty much it as far as where we see antecedents for this ritual. The ritual's pretty short, though, so that's pretty much all we really need to find origins for. Now, as far as this ritual goes, a lot of people say a lot of different things about how to do it, why to do it, what it does. Some people have come up with some really great stuff. Some people have some really basic ideas about it. But it's one that, as we've said, is kind of everywhere. Now, if we want to look at how it's actually done, we should probably go back to where it started with the Golden Dawn, because a lot of what's published in books today has various things added and changed in order to kind of fit either what the author wanted or to mimic what they saw in some other source, usually Don Michael Craig. So the Golden... Yeah, and that's in my opinion, the Golden Dawn sources are the best place to learn it, because then you can see how it's actually done. So the first thing that comes into play in the Golden Dawn's description is that you take a steel dagger in your right hand and face east. When we look at some of the stuff Crowley says about it later, we'll see that he describes doing it with a wand, but I think it's important that the Golden Dawn shows a dagger. You first touch your forehead and say Ata, which they translate as thou art, then touch the chest. And you'll see variations of that modernly where people will touch the crotch, or they'll point to the ground and say Malchut, which is the kingdom. Touch the right shoulder and say Vigabora, which means and the power. The left shoulder, Vigadula, which means and the glory. Well, actually, it doesn't, but that's how they translate it in the Golden Dawn. It means mercy. Yeah. And then clasp the hands in front of you and say La'olam, which is forever, and then Amen. La'olam really would mean more through the worlds rather than forever. But yes, they're trying to fit what Levy says.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm. And we find a lot of that in ceremonial magic stuff, that translations don't really match what the language says. Mm-hmm. But in this case, the small changes, for the most part, are ones that are little. They're not too significant to our understanding of the ritual. We want to make sure that we go right to left, not left to right, because otherwise a bishop from the east might come up and punch you. I don't know. First millennium heresy jokes. You could defend yourself with the dagger. So once you've done the Kabbalistic cross, you move to the east, and in the Golden Dawn instructions, it actually has you make an invoking pentagram. And then once you've made the pentagram, you put the point of the dagger into the center and vibrate the divine name. You make these pentagrams in each of the quarters, from the center tracing a circle from one quarter to the other. The divine names that you use are Yed Hevohe, or Yehovah, Adonai, Ehie, and Agla. So basically you have He is, the Lord, I am, and the Lord is mighty forever. Now, one thing you'll see in Rigardi's descriptions typically is that you will imagine a blue flame as you trace the pentagrams and as you trace the circle. This isn't something that is actually referenced in the Golden Dawn description, but again, I think this can be kind of important to some of the symbolism that comes up with it. Once you've traced your circle and the pentagrams, you say, before me, Raphael, behind me, Gabriel, at my right hand, Michael, at my left hand, Oriel. Before me flames the pentagram, behind me shines the six-rayed star. And then you repeat the Kabbalistic cross from the beginning. So overall, the ritual is really, really simple. And
I learned a little bit of it differently, but it doesn't really matter.
I think probably everyone here learned it a little differently than the way that it's actually described there. Interesting, Liber O, which presents the AA's version of it, because a lot of people think that the Star Ruby is the AA's version of the Lesser Pentagram ritual, but it's actually a separate ritual. The AA still uses the LBRP. The instructions are almost the same as what's in the Golden Dawn. So a lot of the things that are added to it later are not added by Crowley. These are things that come in kind of post-Regardi. And Regardi's descriptions usually are pretty much in keeping with the Golden Dawn description as well.
Which kind of makes sense.
Yeah, Regardi was a pretty hardcore Golden Dawn guy.
What's the source for behind me shines the six-rayed star? I swear I remember it already being in the column.
I believe in the column is the verbiage that Crowley uses. I think that's one of the things he changes.
I read it
And-
Why we learned it that way.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually like that better because even I get the visualization, but that always felt awkward to me.
Yeah, visualizing it as in front and behind and then combining in the Magician makes more sense from my perspective. Some of the stuff that Crowley describes as far as the visualizations makes sense for the column in terms of the hexagrams being above and below. But I think a lot of people tend to describe it as if you're imagining like a Masonic hall and the column is the space between the two pillars and the hexagram forms in that space, which I don't think is a very good way of thinking of it, because why would that space be called a column? One of the things that I like to point out that is not in the Golden Dawn version, there are no signs of Horus. A lot of people, because Don Michael Craig included them, replace stabbing the center of the pentagram with making the sign of the Emperor and then the sign of silence.
I've seen that both ways.
Yeah, I think the stab makes more sense. There's some symbolism around the signs of Horus that I don't think work well for it. If we have some time at the end, I'll talk about why I don't think those should be in there. Another thing that's not in the Golden Dawn version is centering on your Holy Guardian Angel when you make the Kabbalistic cross. And I think this is something that's kind of an important difference between the Golden Dawn system and the AA system. The Golden Dawn system, meeting your Holy Guardian Angel, is essentially the crowning point of the system. That's the most important part of the Golden Dawn work. But the Holy Guardian Angel does not form an icon that you are interacting with throughout your work in the Golden Dawn system, at least not in a way that you understand that you're doing so. Your Holy Guardian Angel appears to you through the image of the officers of the temple in the Golden Dawn, whereas in the AA system, you don't have temple officers to do that. You have to have a connection with your Holy Guardian Angel from the beginning, even before you are initiated into the inner chambers of the 5=6 grade. Now, the Golden Dawn says that the ritual is essentially there as a simple banishing ritual that the neophyte is able to learn to have some means of protecting themselves. In the Golden Dawn system, they didn't teach magic until you were in the College of the Adepts. And so the explanation they give is that they teach you this one ritual so that you've got something you can do to keep yourself safe from all the spooky magical forces that you're going to be interacting with through your initiations and all the things that you're learning. It's not really a good description for what it's used for, because it's not what banishing rituals look like. One, you're starting out with an invocation with the Kabbalistic cross. Two, you're walking in a clockwise direction, which in most modern magical systems is viewed as invoking. The Golden Dawn teaches you to do the ritual with invoking pentagrams. And ultimately, even if you use the banishing pentagrams, you're invoking angels in the end. You're not banishing. So, do you know the difference between invoking and banishing, Will?
No.
So, invoking is earnestly praying for something to come to you. It's calling something forth so that you're able to interact with it. A lot of times it's even viewed as you're drawing it in so that you have a mystical divine experience of kind of having God or an angel come into you to commune with your soul directly. Banishing is when you send something away. So if one of your buddies had a ghost haunting his house, you could go in and do a banishing to send the ghost away. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So, most banishing rituals, you're either going to conjure some sort of higher power that directly relates to the spirit being banished, or has some authority over the spirit being banished, and you're going to ask it to send the spirit out. If you look at the Roman Catholic ritual of exorcism, that is what's happening there. You're forcefully telling the spirit to leave, and you're asking God and the various emissaries of God to help you force the spirit to leave. The bornless invocation, or the headless one, is reworked into an invocation by the Golden Dawn and by Crowley. But in the Stele of Jew, the version that appears in the actual PGM materials, the refrain is about sending away a vexing spirit. And so that's a banishing. It's you're calling upon a divine force and you're saying, get you gone, bad spirit. Like, you're not calling a bunch of stuff in and grooving with it. That doesn't banish anything. If you look at a lot of more simple banishings, you might excuse me, you might invoke an elemental force to be destructive towards what it is that you're trying to get rid of. Such as in folk magic, you write the name of someone you want to get rid of, fold it into a paper airplane, and throw it out into the air somewhere where it'll be carried away. Or make a paper boat and let the water carry it away. Or burn it or bury it. So you look at the natural forces of the elements to remove or to destroy what it is that you don't want. None of that happens in this ritual. The ritual also doesn't specify anything that it is actually banishing. You're not telling anything to go away. You're not symbolizing anything that's going away. So there's not a really clear banishing focus. Now there is a banishing component, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I would say the Golden Dawn is using its very popular technique of giving you a blind, or hiding what it really is saying by telling you that it's just a simple banishing. Now, to stick with kind of Golden Dawn views on things, Rigardi has a lot to say about the ritual also. And while Crowley would have said his stuff earlier, we'll look at Rigardi first because he's a little bit more of a Golden Dawn guy. He also says stuff that's a little less interesting than what Crowley says, so we can get him out of the way. I like Rigardi, but he is pretty dry. Rigardi refers to the ritual variously as the banishing ritual or the pentagram ritual. So he uses very general terms which could easily confuse with any of several other rituals. So I think in Rigardi's view, this is kind of like the white bread of magic. This is like the staple thing that everyone's got on their shelf and everyone knows what it is. So you just say, oh, do that banishing ritual. They know what it is because this is the one that everyone does every day. So I think this kind of tells us even in Rigardi's time, before all of this was popularized through a bunch of books, this was still sort of the standard thing that everyone working ceremonial magic knew. He also describes it as auric vibration in the astral light, and says that it contains the protective efficacy of the magical circle. So in Rigardi's view, and Rigardi does this a lot, he talks a lot about doing things in the active imagination, or just kind of visualizing stuff and doing it on the astral, because Rigardi's trying to save the Golden Dawn tradition in a time where there's no Golden Dawn temples. People are not getting together and doing lodge magic together. You have people working on their own or hanging out with their friends or going to hippie gatherings and experimenting with stuff. And so he's got to present it in a way where you can do all this without the props, you can do all this without the space, and you can get something out of it. So it's pretty reasonable for him to interpret the Lesser Banishing Ritual as a way to take this ritual magic idea of building the magical circle and making it into something that you can just kind of do in your head or do astrally or in your aura. The thing is, there's probably a little bit beyond that in regard to his meaning, though, because Crowley says something pretty similar. Now, as far as it making the magical circle, the Greater Key of Solomon makes a circle using 4 divine names, just like the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram does. The names are a little different. It uses El, Yah, Agla, and Adonai. So we've got 2 of the same names, but if we go with El and Yah, we're dealing with much higher points on the Tree of Life than what Crowley and other people say the Lesser Banishing Ritual deals with. But the god names of the Lesser Banishing Ritual don't really deal with those spots on the Tree of Life either. Now, as far as it having the protective elements of a magical circle, do you really feel that protected by the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram? I don't think I know too many people who they get scared or get worried about magical forces and they're like, man, I better do a Lesser Banishing Ritual to protect myself. Usually people do it as an opening of a ritual, or they do it as part of their daily magical workout routine. When you do it, I don't think many people do it and then they kind of think of it as something that they're wearing around through the day, like they have this magic circle that's like built around them now. That's, I think, one of the better ways to look at it. So I don't think practically it really establishes this protective circle. But I do think that it has some relation to the magical circle, and that's another thing we'll come back to as we get a little deeper in. Now, we're at an OTO event, so obviously people are going to be concerned with what Crowley has to say on the subject. I was just going to say, but this is also Blake, so I trust that we're able to not get all stuck on that. But Crowley does say some stuff that is interesting to look at. And so I think the initial key thing that he says that's kind of important for our understanding of it is, those who regard this ritual as a mere device to invoke or banish spirits are unworthy to possess it. Properly understood, it is the medicine of metals and the stone of the wise. So Crowley just tosses out what the Golden Dawn has to say about the ritual. Regardi kind of echoes that when he talks about it in Tree of Life, and even if he doesn't quote Crowley directly, he references Crowley saying that. But Crowley basically is looking at this as a form of the Philosopher's Stone. It's something that is able to help work in the work of transmutation. He also says something which kind of relates it to the magician's personal sphere, or borrowing from anime, his AT field. He says, every man has a natural fortress within himself, the soul impregnable. Besides this central citadel, man also has outer works, the aura. It is the duty of every person to see that his aura is in good condition. There are 2 main methods for doing this. The first is by a performance 2 or 3 times daily of the banishing ritual of the Pentagram. Its main point is to establish in the astral 4 pentagrams, 1 in each quarter, and 2 hexagrams, one above, the other below, thus enclosing the magician, as it were, in a consecrated box. It also places in his aura the divine names invoked. Now, this kind of relates to that idea of the ritual being the medicine of metals. The development of the aura or the personal sphere is a big part of Golden Dawn initiation. This idea that the divine names are put into his aura is basically a structure that was kind of introduced with Golden Dawn initiation, that whatever they were showing you or saying to you was something that they were building into your body of light to slowly change you and also ingrain those powers and those forces into you so that you would have access to them. The consecrated box that he describes, this gets to that idea of the column with the hexagrams. Now, really nothing in the verbiage of the ritual makes it sound like there should be 2 hexagrams. I don't know why that's where he went with it. But I think it's kind of cool, because it's sort of like you have this capacitor. Like, you have this spiritual capacitor that you're walking around in all day that's just like creating this magical force around you to develop your aura. Now, again, I don't think most people engage the ritual that way, and I think if you're not actively engaging it that way, it's not going to have that effect, at least not in a dramatic way. But it's a neat way to conceptualize it. Another element that he says regarding it, and this is the one that you hear frequently, is you are supposed to be standing at the intersection of the paths of Samek and Pe. You are facing Tiferet, the sun. Thus, on your right hand is Nitsa, Venus. On your left hand, Hod, Mercury. And behind you, Yesod, the moon. Along with those notes, he talks more about the column and the appearance of the hexagram. And he talks a little bit about interpreting the appearance of the archangels with some very Golden Dawn-y type of stuff that doesn't really come from any older form of magic. I think this is one of the things that Crowley says about the ritual that I don't really like. Partially, I just don't get with the whole Golden Dawn interpretation of the paths. It doesn't really have a good basis in Jewish Kabbalah. But also, there's an element of connecting to Samek which makes sense for it, because the ritual overall is working you towards your holy guardian angel and working you towards Tiferet, and that's what the path of Samek is about. So that makes sense. But the placement amid the spheres doesn't really work. He's trying to force it to be Kabbalistic, and it's just not Kabbalistic at all. They do. But that's one of the things I find curious about this, is this is a ritual that the Golden Dawn created and didn't intentionally make Kabbalistic. And if you look at the way the god names play out, the way the angel names play out, they don't play out with any clear Kabbalistic placement. They're based more on medieval structures of magic. And even if we try to fit to those Sephiroth that Crowley talks about, some of the angels fit, but not all of them. And the divine names don't fit at all. So, yeah, I've just kind of always ignored that. I just felt that he was trying to find a way to make it fit the rest of the system, but it doesn't have to. But what he says about invoking forces is good. He talks about invoking these archangelic forces into your sphere, much like he talks elsewhere about the divine names being written into your sphere. Now, not looking at what other people say, but my own interpretations, this ritual has a lot of stuff going on. And I don't just mean in terms of the symbolism of it, but the various purposes, the various things it does, and the reasons why it's important for someone's development as a magician. In my mind, the most important part is the invocation of the Holy Guardian Angel. The ritual definitely makes reference to 5 = 6 by sort of insinuating that it's a hexagram ritual, even though it's a pentagram ritual, and so the 5 and the 6 are equal to each other. You have the coming together of the macrocosm and the microcosm with the pentagram and hexagram based on the way they're generally interpreted in Golden Dawn symbolism. So you definitely have this initiation into the Adeptus Minor grade reflected in the ritual. Outside of that, it has an element of dealing with calling upon divine forces and manipulating elemental forces. And so that can be interpreted further as that marriage of heaven and earth that is related to the 5 = 6. and the connection with the Holy Guardian Angel. To Rigardi's point about this dealing with the actual spiritual efficacy of the magical circle, when we look at the magical circle in the grimoires, it's not just something that is building a wall or a shield in order to keep spirits away. Because in a lot of grimoire work, the circle is somewhat permeable. Spirits are able to enter into the circle, spirits are able to manifest in the circle if they're the spirits that are called to do so. The circle often has a defensive element in the way that it's described in the conjurations, but most of the conjurations of the circle are primarily placed with conjurations of the divine. You're basically building a mobile temple. So you're saying that the circle is this kind of nexus point where God, the sort of spirit of the place or the environment, and the soul of the magician come together and are united into one thing. And that is incredibly important for specifically any sort of conjuration to work, but really any kind of magic to work, because you're dealing with the various different levels that are going into this creation. The magician is the one who is kind of making the determination of what to happen. He's making the determination through that creative power and creative authority that is imagined in the conjuration of the divine. And the spirit of the place is something which often has been ignored in kind of your post-Golden Dawn modern magic, but we're starting to see that work in more as people are looking at more of the grimoire magic and more traditional magic, that in order to be able to operate with spirits, you have to deal with the spirits of the locality in which you're operating. And so the environment is itself a living thing that is infused with spiritual nature and a life of its own. So whether you're looking at a particular guardian spirit that is a manifest entity that you can go up and talk to that's in a place, or if you're just saying, hey, this particular spot of ground that we're on has part of the Animus Mundi in it and has a life to it, and we're cordoning this off, and so that cordoned off part is now sort of its own spiritual being. You're blending yourself and God and that spiritual presence together in order to create an environment that not only allows the spirit to manifest or allows your goal to manifest, but allows you to interact with the spiritual efficacy of it, because you yourself are part of that space in which it's manifesting. And so the magical circle overall is ultimately an invocation of the divine. And within the Golden Dawn system and the AA system, the Holy Guardian Angel is the form of the divine that we directly invoke and directly deal with. So if the ritual is a creation of the magical circle, it is, by that virtue, an invocation of the Holy Guardian Angel. The next element of its purpose, in my opinion, is banishing the force of Earth. And I think, yeah, you've known me long enough to have heard me talk about this before, probably. And this is one that I think a lot of people don't see when they look at the ritual. But the supreme ritual of the pentagram, or the greater ritual of the pentagram, those rituals deal with creating an equilibration of the elements. You're working with all of the elements, and you're working with the spirit actives and spirit passives in those rituals. Whereas in the lesser ritual, you're only working with one element at a time. So all you're doing is either invoking or banishing that specific element within the light of your Holy Guardian Angel. The Earth Pentagram is the one that's initially introduced. Most times people work with this ritual. And that could just be because the pentacle is a tool of Earth, and the pentagram and the pentacle kind of get equated, and so you put those together. Some people say it's because Earth contains all of the other elements, and so by invoking or banishing Earth, you're dealing with all of the rest of the elements in a grounded fashion. However, in no other place in ceremonial magic do we treat all of the elements simply as being encapsulated within Earth, so I don't think that makes a ton of sense. If we look at what Earth is, though, Earth particularly in the Golden Dawn and AA system, has to do with stability. In some other systems, we see a little bit more of a generative element of the Earth, but that generation element isn't as focused on in the Golden Dawn or in the AA. It's more about receiving something and then taking that reception and making it into a solid, manifest, knowable, sensible thing, which is in and of itself generation, but it's a way of looking at generation from kind of a, we want to be taking things and taking them into this ephemeral spiritual place. So when we go the other way, we're taking that ephemeral spiritual nature and we're fixing it into this solid thing, this solid form. When we banish Earth, we're loosening all of that up. So if you think about, you go out in the winter and it's cold and the soil is dark and hard, you can't plant things because you can't open the soil up. You can't build things out of the soil because you can't move the soil. The ground's completely stabilized. It's at its most earthy point. But
Where you are on the globe.
depending on where, yes. Winter here,
Yes.
and or Siberia, all the time in Siberia, and so if you wanted to be able to make changes, if you wanted to be able to develop things or grow things or change things, you would have to soften all of that up. You'd have to apply something to make the Earth able to move and be molded and be shaped. That's what the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram does. We go through and we banish the Earth from all quarters of the world. The different quarters represent the different elements, and therefore, well, not necessarily the different elements, but they represent the 4 altitudes of rulership that control all things within existence. Everything that's manifest somehow is channeled through one of the quarters or is ruled by one of the quarters. So if we go through and we soften all of those up and say, hey, you can't be rigid anymore, you can't be fixed, you can't say everything is the way that it is right now, we destroy some of that order and we allow a little chaos in, a little movement in, then we can make changes to it. And in the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, we're doing this within the light of our angel, because we've already done the Kabbalistic cross. We're commanding that we have the ability to banish these elemental quarters by using the divine names, which are all 4-letter names and are therefore essentially elemental keys that allow us to access the quarters. And then once we've done this, we're restructuring the quarters by conjuring the archangels, which are essentially the Briatic versions of these quarterly rulerships. So if you look in more medieval and Renaissance magic, you'll see that each quarter has an archangel, each quarter has a king, and each quarter has an archdemon. And so you have sort of the higher, the governor, and then the lower, that are all different forces that kind of control how things channel through. Now, again, Golden Dawn magic doesn't address this fully. It references it. We see places in the Golden Dawn where it references the elemental kings. We see echoes of these elemental archangels referenced as well, and different forms of this elemental rulership structure is in place. So it's there in the system. It's just not activated in the same way. But here, we can also look at the way the Kabbalistic 4 worlds play out in Golden Dawn means of invocation. And so you have the divine name in Atziluth. Will, do you know what Atziluth is? So, can you imagine if something were the perfect idea of a whole class of things? Like, so you know how you go to McDonald's and they have one kind of French fry, and you go to Burger King and they have another kind of French fry, you go to Wendy's and they have another kind of French fry. Well, somewhere in the universe there has to be this idea of the perfect French fry that all of the French fries are based on, right?
Yeah.
That's what Atziluth is. Atziluth is the perfect idea of everything that has all French fry-ness in it. And it's that for everything in creation. Yes. Bria, would then be kind of, as you take that perfect idea of French fries and you start to move it down into, this is how French fries smell, this is what we think of when we think of French fries, this is how French fries make us feel, these are the sensations we have. But it's not the French fry itself, it's just all the stuff that's sort of the perfect manifest qualities of the French fry. And so that's what the archangels are. They're not quite God in perfection for that particular quarter, but they're all the characteristics and ideas of that quarter being perfected. And so we're saying, within the light of our angel, when we rework these quarters into what they're supposed to be, into what we want ourselves to be, we're drawing in these sort of perfected characteristics and making ourselves this knowable but still higher version of what is, and allowing the forces that come into our lives to also be these knowable but higher versions of these forces. So if you wanted stuff to come into your life, would you want it to come in on a garbage truck, or would you want it to come in on like a limousine? Right. So that's kind of what this is. It's saying that we're not going to take all the beat up junk that is there in life already. We're going to banish that and get rid of all that, and we're going to draw in and replace it with that nicer, cooler version of what it is. And this is sort of how the magician is able to transmute himself and his world. This is how the ritual is able to be the medicine of metals. It allows you to soften up yourself so that your angel can come in and say, all right, you're not stuck in this rigidity, you're not stuck in all the things that distract you in life and all the things that make you not yourself. We've broken all that up, and now we can rebuild the way it's supposed to be. Now, I've already talked a little bit about the 4 directions, and that's another important element of this ritual. The archangels in this, again, are not based on the Kabbalah. They're based on the archangels of the 4 winds, or the 4 altitudes of rulership. They don't match to the Sephirot, and so in that way, the ritual looks a lot more like an alchemical ritual and like a medieval ritual of ceremonial magic than it does a modern Kabbalistic ritual, which I think is really cool, since it's the basis of all these later modern Kabbalistic rituals. We kind of already talked about the importance of direction in magic, but from a conjuration perspective, it's very important for the magician to be able to deal with these forces. And I think this is something where this doesn't get addressed in the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, and it's something that we're starting to see addressed more in magic. And I think it's something that we can kind of bring back into the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, since that's a place where a lot of people start. When you're conjuring any particular force, or whether it's a spirit or an angel, or if it's just the idea of this force that you're conjuring, the elemental kings, or the directional kings, are basically the ones that say this gets to come into the world or this doesn't get to come into the world. They are kind of the guys that are the doorkeepers, ready to keep stuff out or let stuff in and decide this is manifest or this is not manifest. They're the rulers of the terrestrial sphere. So if we're going to do magic, engaging with those forces from early on can be kind of important. And this ritual gives us a way of engaging with those directional forces and those directional powers. Now, we're not walking up and being like, all right, Amaymon, Paymon, Egan, Orions, let's hang out, chat, have some tea, and figure out how we're going to let my stuff that I'm calling into the world come up. We're going to a softer, nicer place and dealing with the archangels. But I think it's still important to look at how the archangels play into this chain of forces and how they transmit. Another element of this that's kind of important and useful is looking at Hermetic medicine. Illness, from a Hermetic perspective, is based on an imbalance of elemental forces. So essentially the 4 humors. There's a Renaissance depiction of this that deals with the 4 kings in their towers mediating between the archangels and the archdemons of the directions, and how they're the archangels are holding back the onslaught of these demonic forces on the person in the center of the tower. And that's sort of another core idea of Hermetic medicine, that you have these various influences that are going to come into your life, and you have to manage how those influences come in. And then once those influences are there, if they haven't been managed properly, they're going to imbalance you in one direction or another. Will, what happens when you lose balance?
You fall over.
You fall. Good job. So you don't want to fall. You want to be in a position where you're in control of what's happening. You know what's happening with the forces in your life. And so working with these kind of governors that are able to decide how these forces play in is an important part of that. And of course, again, doing it with your angel is seated in Tiferet. Aaron Leach will tell you that it's super cosmic, which doesn't actually mean anything at all. But everyone else will tell you that the angel is seated in Tiferet. And as we know from working in, particularly in OTO structure, which is very Tiferet driven, it's all about balance. Tiferet is the place where the other forces are directed and ordered so that they're able to work in the cosmos in a balanced fashion. And so having your angel there as you're working with these quarterly forces is an important part of establishing that balance in yourself. I think the last thing that it has as a purpose is to teach you how to do ritual magic. Now, the structure of this ritual, I used to kind of associate with Solomonic magic when I was younger, and we'll talk about how it's structured. Because off the cuff, it's got some similar elements, but really these are just the elements of ritual magic. Solomonic magic tends to be structured in a way in which you have a consecration, which usually we see with the conjuration of the space and the circle. An invocation, which is kind of dealing with your purity and your connection to the divine. A lot of that happens with the vesting of the various tools upon the magician. You have the actual evocation, where you're calling the spirits themselves. Constricting, where you are basically honing in that conjuration to demand that the spirits appear in a certain way and they behave in a certain way. Binding, where you request a particular thing of the spirit and you make the agreement that it's going to do the thing. And then releasing, where you send the spirit off to do its work, and you're like, hey, we're going to be buddies, you're going to make this happen, it's all going to be good. Lesser Banishing Ritual, the Pentagram, has some of that, or some things that relate to that. It's definitely got the consecration. In fact, the consecration is sort of the bulk of what the ritual is. Instead of having invocation outside of that consecration, it has banishing. And then it follows that banishing up with kind of either an invocation or an evocation of the archangels, depending on how you use the terminology, and also depending on how you're working with them in the ritual. And then it closes with an additional consecration instead of any sort of licensing to depart. It's basically working from the perspective that these angels that you've conjured and these divine names are part of your sphere now, or they're acting in your sphere, so you're not sending them away. I think this structure could still be used as an alternative structure to ritual magic and to conjuration. I think we see this a lot. I'm sure we've all been to rituals where you could look at the way someone structured the ritual, and it's kind of like you can see the pieces of the Lesser Banishing Ritual, the Pentagram, where you've got some sort of invocation at the beginning, you have some sort of banishing that's done in light of that invocation, you have some further invocation for whatever it is you're particularly working with, and then you kind of again return to that same divine purpose, restating what it is that you're doing in the light of whatever divinity you've called. Rigardi kind of hints at the idea of using this for other ritual magic purposes by talking about using sigils with the pentagrams. I think it could also be adjusted for conjuration. You could use the same structure and call upon something other than the angels. You could still call upon those same four archangels and insert some other ritual component for working with the archangels or asking them to do something. You could work with a particular archangel, even if you call all four, and use that angel seal as the focus for kind of activating that angel into a more active, animated presence within the ritual. Now, the way that this is commonly used by most people outside of a daily exercise is a way to open up rituals. And this is something, since the beginning of my time interacting with ceremonial magicians in a group, that I've been like, oh gosh, guys, come on, let's not do that. I am not a huge fan of using the lesser banishing ritual, lesser hexagram ritual combination as an opening, because while I think there is a justification for doing that, I think when a lot of people do it, they do it without thinking about what it is they're doing. In fact, I've seen a lot of rituals where the script will say, either use a combination of the LBRP and the LHR, or use the Star Ruby and the Star Sapphire. So, well, those rituals don't do the same things. So you're not really structuring ritual magic. You're not putting together something where all your parts deal with a particular end and have a particular function. If you're going to say, I can swap either or. I think a lot of what people want out of opening with these rituals and closing with these rituals can be accomplished by using other rituals that are common in ceremonial magic. And outside of being able to use other rituals to do the same thing, sometimes it's redundant to the ritual structure. A lot of times you'll see people put those in place because that's kind of what they've seen or what they read in a book. But then their ritual contains all the components for banishing and cleansing the space, invoking the divine light, calling upon whatever things are going to be facilitating the ritual. And so all the stuff that you would be using the LBRP for is already done in the ritual. So there's no reason to have them both there. Personally, as far as an opening, the structure I like to use, opening with Holy art thou, Lord of the universe, holy art thou whom nature hath not formed, holy art thou, vast and mighty one, Lord of light and of darkness. One thing that I don't tend to look at with this, but I thought was kind of pertinent for this, is that can be viewed as having sort of an elemental pentagram structure to it, because you're essentially describing the arc divine force in 5 different ways. I don't think it's really intended to be elemental or intended to relate to the pentagram, but in looking at it as something to kind of line up with an alternate opening, that kind of is interesting. Then usually I will follow that up with first then the Priest of Fire and Hear Thou the Voice of Fire, those passages that come from the Chaldean oracles that are popular in Golden Dawn magic. Now, one thing that is interesting with those is they essentially form a hexagram. When you are working with those passages, you're conjuring fire and you're conjuring water, and you're doing them in ways where the conjuration is related one to the other, and so you're sort of conjuring each one by alluding to the other one. A lot of times people put them in place as if they're banishing, but you're really sort of invoking those two forces into the space so that they come together and balance into that divine presence. You have a consecration with the water, and then you have a sort of vivification or invocation of divine force with the fire. When I want to actually banish, the ritual I use is one that comes from the Order of the Celestial Academy, which is now defunct. But it's really simple. You basically take a bowl of water, and the bowl of water can't be a bowl that you're using for any other point in the ritual, because the bowl will be contaminated when you're done. You take a cork or a piece of string, or rope, you light that on fire, put the fire into the water, and say Kreniptosai, which I can't remember what it means, it's some Greek thing. But the idea there, by combining the fire and the water in that way, you're creating a cloud, or you're conjuring air, specifically in sort of a steamy form that can pick things up. And then you circumambulate the temple with that bowl of fire and water, and then you place it outside of the temple, so that your cloud, just like a real cloud, has picked up all the spiritual dirt in the space, real cloud picking up pollutants and dirt in the air, and then you put it outside of your space. So you're literally physically taking it away. So that's me. That's what I do as an opening. Other people do other things. Everyone can really do what they want, I suppose. Commonly, it's used as a daily ritual. I think this can be really important when people are starting out in magic. There's a lot of benefits to doing it as a daily ritual. Most of the purposes that I described that the ritual has, you kind of get those by doing it on a daily basis for a period of time. But it's something that can be overdone. You can do it to a point where you're working with banishing air and reducing your stability to the point where you become too unstable. And you might need to do some invoking pentagram rituals in order to counter that. Rigardi talks about, I think, invoking in the morning and banishing at night for it. I would probably flip those if I were going to recommend that kind of structure. It's also something that it doesn't do you any good if it's just a rote performance or if it's just being phoned in. Crowley talks about this a little bit in his notes on it. And I think there are some rituals where if you just say the passage or you just do the thing, they kind of have that opera ex operand, where they work because of the work. They don't work because of what you're doing or because of you. This isn't one of those. This is something where you've got to be actively engaging in what it is. And so if you're doing it so often that you can't make yourself focus on the parts, can't make yourself focus on the experiences, it's not going to do you any good. At that point, you're better off taking a month or so and just not doing it, and then starting again when you can reapproach it. It can be used for practical magic. And this is one that I have never been big on using it for this. I don't even really use this ritual at all anymore. When I was doing the Abramelin working, I thought I was going to use all of these standard rituals throughout the working, and when I got through the 3 days of penance at the beginning, my angel's like, alright, they're done. You don't need those anymore. Just don't use them. And so special times for certain things, yes, but not as like regular use for me anymore. But I think for people who are starting out, kind of like Mather says in the knowledge lecture, it's a way that someone who's just learning the basic components of magic can have something that they can do to actually do some magic. And I think this is something that, unfortunately, is probably one of the biggest things that is missed with this ritual, because people get so used to the idea of using it just as I was told I should do this, I need to do this every day, and they don't look at how this can be a basis for the idea of doing magic to get stuff done. So, and I think that's sort of where a lot of that idea that magic is only for spiritual purposes comes in, is that people start off with it and they only approach it as mysticism, and they don't get to approach it as practical magic. So some ways in which you can do that, the most basic one, and this one even is sort of still kind of on the mystical end of things, is working with the other elemental components. So say you're going through a period where you feel really disconnected and you're not able to engage your emotions, or you feel like you're just not really feeling the full force of the things you're experiencing and you want to have a more rich experience on an emotional level. You would do the Lesser Banishing Ritual with invoking water pentagrams. Conversely, if you were just too emotional and you felt that you were just going into hysterics and things were just too much for you to deal with, Lesser Banishing Ritual with banishing water pentagrams. Studying for a test and you need to focus and you need to be able to deal with ideas, invoking air pentagrams. If you are having trouble where you're too focused and you're too in your head and you can't get into actually like doing other things aside from like thinking, reading, stuff like that, banishing air pentagrams. Good job. So it's a pretty simple way of approaching it for magical purposes. There's a rabbi that told me once about a mystic who used to carry a coin in his pocket. On one side it said, "Your divine breath," and on the other side it says, "Your dirt." Both things are what it says in Genesis. They're the two elements of how man is created. And so basically the idea was whenever he felt too full of himself and too like excited about how awesome he was, he'd pull out the coin and look at the part that said that he was dirt. Whenever he felt too down in the dumps or felt like he wasn't good enough or he wasn't doing what he needed to do, he'd pull out the coin and look at the side that said that he was divine breath. This ritual can work a lot like that, where you can take two extremes or imbalances of the elemental forces, and you can either invoke or banish the element in order to kind of counter where you are. If you have a really significant imbalance of the element, you could invoke the counterbalancing element in order to kind of balance yourself out even further. Another way of working with this practically is to do zodiacal work. People always think of it as being elemental, but in the Golden Dawn Pentagram lecture, it talks about how you can work with the pentagrams for zodiacal invocations. The Golden Dawn doesn't get too heavy into zodiacal magic, and in kind of a hermetic structure that the Golden Dawn is based on, zodiacal stuff is like the more advanced stuff and would have been the things that you would have been dealing with as you're moving into the third order. But if you wanted to use this to work with the zodiac, you could pick a particular element that you're invoking, and so do your water invoking pentagram if it is a water sign, and then when you are envisioning the hexagram appearing, you could specifically envision it being traced as the planetary hexagram that relates to the zodiacal sign, or you could even physically trace out the planetary hexagram related to that sign. You could make it even more hands-on, and as you're tracing the pentagram, you could trace the hexagram in each quarter along with the pentagram. And you could, when you're tracing the hexagram, just like you're using the sort of 4 elemental key names, you could use a 7-fold name with the hexagram to relate to the planetary forces. Or you could use the name related to that particular planetary force. You could swap out angels and use planetary or zodiacal angels instead of the 4 directional angels. You could take the angel that rules that zodiac sign, and instead of intoning your holy guardian angel in the Kabbalistic cross, intone the angel of the zodiac sign so that the operation is functioning under his rulership. Or you could take the planetary angels and use the names of the planetary angel related to the planet for that zodiac sign in the fire and the air quadrants, and then use the elemental angel for that sign in the water and earth quadrants. So you have this sort of projective element of the planets with the receptive element of the elements combining to make the zodiac. As we mentioned before, Rigardi talks about the use of sigil magic with the ritual. Now, Rigardi's idea, he's fighting impure magnetism. So this is the idea, say, Will gets into running races when he gets into high school, and so he starts conjuring Mars so that he can win his races all the time. But then he gets too martial, and so he's just like, I'm angry. And so he needs to fight that impure magnetism. So he would do the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, and maybe banish fire instead of banishing earth. And then as you're doing the banishment, that's where you might throw in the sign of Horus and project the symbol of Mars out into the quarter that's being banished, and just imagine it disintegrating, so that you're banishing that impure magnetism of the martial force. You could also... So it was a good example. We could...
On Roblox, there's a game called 4 Elements.
It's kind of cool. You could also do more practical sigil magic. So say your goal is to get a new job. You might make a seal towards that idea, and then project that seal and make earth invoking pentagrams as you project the seal. If your goal is is to banish someone who is emotionally destructive. Then you might make a seal representing that person, project the seal, and make water banishing pentagrams to banish the emotional influence of that person. So you can work with these elemental ideas, work with these invocations and evocations, but then focus them on a particular element of your life. I think, having kind of dealt with some ways to deal with it practically, the biggest thing that I would have to say about this ritual is that people need to make sure they examine what they're doing, and then they need to move on to bigger and better stuff. There's nothing wrong with this ritual. It's a great ritual. This ritual is really, really deep. It's something that people should examine. They should learn from it because there's a ton of stuff to learn. It maps out basically the whole purpose of the Golden Dawn system and the basic ideas of the Golden Dawn system. And unfortunately, a lot of people do it complacently because they study it in the concept of some beginner books instead of studying it in that Golden Dawn context or that AA context. And if people kind of get rid of that complacency and really dive into the ritual, they can explore its depths. The problem is, once you get through those depths, the ritual is also a little shallow. Like, it doesn't have a lot that you're doing. It has some ways that you can kind of augment it towards various applications and doing various things that might be useful. But there's a lot of other magic out there that's going to do those things better. And it's going to take you to further exploration of what you're going to do. So people get into this trap where they think of this as kind of the height of magic, that this ritual has so much stuff going on despite its small, simple package, that this is it. This is what there is. This is the big thing to be studying and focusing on. But even the Golden Dawn didn't treat it that way. The Golden Dawn was like, this is how we're going to introduce this kind of ritual structure to you, and then we've got a bunch of other rituals that use it and build on that structure, and then we have even cooler, bigger stuff after that. And there's a whole world of magic out there. So people should use this because it's got a lot of cool stuff for beginners in it. And it's like your basic exercise. It's like going to the gym to train for the big day, for whatever it is that you're going to go do. But you don't go to the gym for your end game unless you're a competitive CrossFitter. You go to the gym in order to get ready for what it is you're going to do. And that's what the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram is. It's part of what I like to call magical aerobics, which sounds dismissive, but the thing is, it's incredibly important. If you don't have yourself fit in a magical sense, you're not going to be able to do all the cool things that you can do with magic, or explore all the things that you can explore with magic. But it's important to remember that you don't go to the gym and do your aerobics just do your aerobics. You go to the gym and do your aerobics so that you're healthy and you can go out and enjoy life and do other things. So that's pretty much what I've got. I mentioned the signs of Horus, so real quick reference on those. From what I can tell, those are popular in the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram because of Don Michael Craig. I think there were some small variant Golden Dawn groups that used that, and I think that's how Craig kind of worked it in. My assumption has always been that it comes in because of the use of them in the Star Ruby, and people get it confused, or people got it confused at some point back in like the 80s somewhere, and it kind of grew from there. Yeah, stabby is fun.
I found the dagger and stabbing, and that seems to work pretty well.
The explanation I've seen for using the sign of Horus is that you're exchanging energy between yourself and the pentagram. But the pentagram's not a vortex, it's not a portal, there's nothing to exchange energy with.
It's just something you just create.
Right, so that doesn't make a ton of sense in my mind. But the forms, the god forms in the Golden Dawn tradition, are used to invoke particular forces. They're the physical component of assuming a god form. And with Horus, you are conjuring a solar god form in that structure. And it's a god form that's related to the Holy Guardian Angel. Hold on just a moment, Will. And so in that sense, it makes sense to combine with the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram. Except that the sun is a fixative element. it's sulfuric. So wouldn't want to do that at the point where you're banishing, because you're taking something apart but fixing it at the same time. So you're essentially counteracting the banishing motion. The dagger makes a lot of sense because the dagger is a tool of banishing. I think the other element of the dagger making sense is the dagger is the corresponding tool to the pentacle. And so you're working with that earth force and you're working with this planar symbol, and you're commanding that through the use of the dagger, which is how you would work with the pentacle in ritual magic. So you're combining that interaction of the masculine and the feminine force through the dagger and the pentacle by the way that it's working in the ritual. When you use the wand, yes, that was always what I thought of in that part too. When Crowley says to use the wand, it kind of feels to me like when Wiccans use the dagger and the chalice instead of using the wand and the chalice and the dagger and the pentacle. You're mixing different letter correspondences, but you're dealing with the highest and the lowest, so it kind of goes back to that idea, I guess, of all of the elements being incorporated in. I think Crowley just preferred the wand, though. They are. They're important. I mean, I think the wand and the ring are the two most important tools, aside from the magician himself or herself. I'm a tool. No. All right. So, Will, you had a question.
Nothing, I was just making a picture of the sun.
Oh, okay. That was clever. All right. So, well, that's all I've got. Unless anyone else had any questions or anything to add, or
Thank you, people.
no problem.
It's been a lot